I hate flying. Not because I'm scared of planes. I've done it 100 times for work, but because of the unpredictability. Delays, crying kids, the tiny seats. It's a necessary evil, but still, I dread it. This time, I was flying to Chicago for a big client meeting, an overnight trip. Quick and painless, I hoped. The gate area was packed when I arrived, a sea of tired faces staring at their phones. I found an empty chair, pulled out my laptop, and started reviewing my presentation. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed someone sitting 2 seats away, staring at me. A man, mid-40s, with an odd, unkempt look, disheveled hair, a jacket that looked 2 sizes too big, and eyes that didn't blink enough. I ignored him and kept working. But I could feel his gaze on me. I told myself I was imagining it. People stare sometimes. It's nothing. When boarding was announced, I got in line, relieved to leave the gate behind. I had splurged on an aisle seat for extra legroom, and as I settled in, I hoped for an empty seat next to me. But of course, fate had other plans. As I walked down the aisle, I saw him, the man from the gate. It was strange because I hadn't seen him in line before me. I looked at my seat number and realized that my seat was right beside his. He looked at me, smiled. His teeth were too white, too even, and said, "Looks like we're neighbors." His voice was soft, almost soothing, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Great," I muttered, sliding as close to the armrest as I could. I sat down, his oversized jacket brushing my arm. I tried to focus on my laptop again, but his presence was off. I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the way he kept shifting in his seat, or that faint metallic smell that seemed to cling to him. As the plane took off, I glanced over and saw him clutching a small leather-bound notebook. He was scribbling furiously, his pen moving so fast it looked like it might tear through the pages. "What's that?" I asked, unable to stop myself. He stopped writing abruptly and turned to me. His smile was back, wider now. "Notes." "Notes for what?" "People." That was vague enough to make me uncomfortable. I decided not to push further and turned back to my screen. But I could feel him watching me. Every time I glanced at him, his eyes darted away, like he was trying not to get caught. The flight attendant came by with drinks. I ordered a soda, and he asked for coffee. When the drinks arrived, he didn't touch his. He just sat there, staring at the cup like it was some alien object. "Are you heading to Chicago for work?" I asked, trying to make small talk and ease the tension. He tilted his head, considering the question. "No," he said finally. "I'm going for closure." The way he said it made my stomach twist. "Closure?" I asked hesitantly. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "It's personal." I nodded, deciding I didn't need to know more, but he didn't stop talking. "Have you ever felt like someone was following you?" He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" "Like they're always there, watching, waiting, and you can't escape them?" He smiled again, but this time it wasn't friendly. It was something else, something wrong. "No," I said quickly, my throat dry. "Can't say I have." He nodded, as if he expected that answer. Then he opened his notebook again, flipping to a fresh page. "Do you mind if I draw you?" he asked. "What?" I laughed nervously, hoping he was joking. "It helps me remember people." "I'd rather you didn't." His smile faltered. "Of course," he said, but his hand still moved over the page, his pen scratching furiously. The rest of the flight passed in agonizing silence. I tried to lose myself in my work, but every time I glanced at him, he was staring at me or writing in that damn notebook. The plane felt smaller, the air thicker, and by the time we landed, I was ready to bolt. As we taxied to the gate, he turned to me one last time. "I enjoyed sitting next to you," he said, his voice soft. "You have good energy." "Thanks," I muttered, grabbing my bag. I didn't wait for him to move. I stood up and practically ran off the plane. In the terminal, I stopped at a coffee shop, needing caffeine to shake off the encounter. As I waited for my order, I glanced at my phone. My heart stopped. There was a notification from an airdrop, a file titled portrait.jpg. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I deleted it immediately and turned off airdrop altogether. But as I walked to the baggage claim, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced around, but I didn't see him. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. When I got to my hotel later that night, I noticed something tucked into the outer pocket of my suitcase. A small piece of paper. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. It was a sketch. My face staring back at me with eerie precision. Underneath, in small, childlike handwriting, were 3 words: "We'll meet again." I didn't sleep that night, and now, every time I fly, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, waiting for him to show up again.
I've been a flight attendant for nearly 10 years. I've seen it all. Nervous first-time flyers, drunk bachelorette parties, and even the occasional celebrity trying to fly under the radar. It's a job that keeps you on your toes, but I've always loved it. That changed after the red-eye flight from Denver to Boston last year. The plane wasn't full, which was unusual for a red-eye. Most passengers settled in quickly, eager to sleep through the flight. I just finished checking that the overhead bins were secure when I noticed him. He was sitting in 13A, by the window. A man in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a worn leather jacket. He was staring straight ahead, not at his phone, not out the window, just ahead. His posture was stiff, almost unnaturally so, and his hands were folded tightly in his lap. At first, I didn't think much of it. People can be tense before a flight. But as I moved down the aisle, I glanced back at him. He hadn't moved an inch. When we took off, I began my routine service. Most passengers declined drinks or snacks, murmuring a polite, "No thank you," as they dozed off. But when I reached 13A, he didn't respond. "Sir?" I asked, leaning closer. "Can I get you something to drink?" His head turned slowly, too slowly. as if he'd forgotten how to move. His eyes met mine, and my breath caught. His gaze was empty, hollow. I don't know how else to describe it. It wasn't just that he didn't blink. It was like there was nothing behind his eyes at all. "No," he said finally, his voice low and flat. Then he turned back to stare straight ahead. I moved on quickly, brushing off the unease. Maybe he was just tired or anxious. People can be strange when they fly, but something about him stayed with me. Every time I walked down the aisle, I felt his eyes on me, even when I wasn't looking at him. About an hour into the flight, I went to check the lavatories. One was occupied, the other empty. But when I passed the occupied one, I heard whispering. Not the normal, muffled kind of talking you sometimes hear through the door. It was louder, like whoever was inside wanted to be heard. I leaned closer, trying to make out the words, but they didn't make sense. It wasn't English, or at least not any English I recognized. It sounded rhythmic, almost like chanting. "Hello?" I called softly, knocking on the door. The whispering stopped immediately. A moment later, the door opened. It was him, the man from 13A. I stepped back, startled. Are you all right, sir?" He didn't answer. Instead, he brushed past me without a word and returned to his seat. I watched as he sat back down, resuming his unnervingly rigid posture. I glanced at the lavatory, half expecting to see something out of place, but it was spotless. Trying to shake it off, I returned to the galley where my coworker Sarah was preparing the coffee cart. "Hey, did you serve the guy in 13A?" I asked her. She frowned. "No, why?" "I don't know. He's just weird. Gave me the creeps." Sarah laughed. "You're probably tired. These red eyes can get to all of us." I forced a smile, but her words didn't help. Something about 13A wasn't just weird. It felt wrong. A little later, I walked down the aisle again to check on the passengers. Most were asleep by now, heads tilted against windows or resting on travel pillows, but not him. He was awake, of course, staring ahead like always. Only this time, his head was tilted slightly toward me, and his lips were moving. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his mouth was forming words, quick and deliberate. I hesitated. "Sir, are you all right?" He stopped moving, his lips freezing mid-word, and turned his head to me. For the first time, he smiled. It wasn't warm or polite. It was wide, too wide, and his teeth looked almost sharp. I stepped back instinctively, my heart pounding. "Yes," he said, his voice dripping with something I couldn't place. "Everything is fine." I hurried back to the galley, my hands shaking. I didn't tell Sarah what had happened. I didn't want her to think I was losing it. As the flight neared its end, I began collecting trash from the passengers. When I reached 13A, I noticed something unusual. His tray table was down, and on it sat a folded piece of paper. "Do you need to throw anything away?" I asked, my voice unsteady. He didn't respond. Instead, he picked up the piece of paper, held it out to me, and smiled again. Hesitant, I took it from him. As I walked back to the galley, I unfolded it. It was a sketch. My face, perfectly drawn down to the smallest detail. But there was something wrong with the eyes. They were darkened, as if they were blocked out. My stomach flipped. I shoved the paper into my pocket and tried to compose myself as we prepared for landing. When the plane touched down and the passengers began disembarking, I avoided 13A. I didn't want to look at him again. But when the cabin emptied, I couldn't resist. I walked to his row, expecting to find him gone. Instead, his seat was empty and the seatbelt was still fastened. I glanced around the plane, but he wasn't there. It was impossible. I had seen him just minutes before. I checked with Sarah and the ground crew, but no one could account for him. It was as if he'd disappeared. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sketch was still in my pocket. I stared at it for a long time before throwing it into the trash. But now every time I fly, I check seat 13A. I know it's irrational, but I can't help it. I feel like he's still out there, waiting to board my flight again.